it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat. I'm really excited today to be speaking to two experts about sheep health and particularly how to tackle Haemonchus. And this is a podcast that we're doing in partnership with Elanco. Dawn Bowness is a vet based at Clevedale Vets, and she's an advanced practitioner in sheep health and production, and she will be telling you more about herself during the podcast. And then Kaz Strycharczyk is also a veterinary surgeon who is now at the Black Sheep Farm Health Practice. He's been there since 2018 and again is fascinated with sheep health. He's in 100% farm practice. So really looking forward to the presentation on how to tackle Haemonchus. I'm going to let you two guys introduce yourselves. So perhaps Dawn first, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dawn. As Anthony said, I'm a farm vet at Clevedale Veterinary Practice in North Yorkshire. I've been graduated since 2009, at which time I've been mainly doing farm work, certainly exclusively farm work for the last 8 to 10 years, with a focus on sheep health, but we're a mixed practice, so we do a bit of all sorts as well. Got a real interest in the sheep work and preventative medicine in sheep.
And Kaz.
Cool. Thanks for having me, guys. So, my name's Kaz. I am a vet and partner up at Black Sheep Farm Health, and we are a 100% farm animal practice in beautiful Northumberland. And just because of the type of clientele we have, there's very little sort of dairy work, which would be the sort of normal bread and butter of a farm vet. So we sort of scratch a living from the great beef and sheep clients we have in this part of the world. And much like Dawn, I have been lucky enough to get stuck in with some really proactive clients. Sheep medicine especially is really all about prevention. If you're traveling around looking at sick sheep, yes, that's important, but it's probably not the most sustainable thing to be doing. So given where we are in the country, so that's that sort of far northeast of England, I'm quite excited to be talking about Haemonchus because I think we're sort of at the bleeding edge of it a bit. Or at least the disease. So I'll be interested to see what Dawn's got to say. And happy to get into it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important with animals like sheep. It is very much looking at it from a whole herd, whole flock perspective, isn't it? So how has sort of Haemonchus changed from 35, 40 years ago when I was doing my sheep work at university and briefly in practice, where I remember obviously being taught about it in parasitology, but it wasn't, I don't think, a huge problem. I was mainly practicing up in the Northwest and in Wales, but I believe it's really spread over the ensuing decades. Dawn, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about the history and how things have been developing?
Yeah, so I think its true prevalence is not that well understood in the UK, and the reason for that is it has on a fecal egg count. On a normal dung sample, it looks very much like the other Trichostrongi legs. So unless you're doing further testing and speciation on a fecal sample, you can't tell the difference between it and some of the other gut worms. So it's often been diagnosed at post-mortem, or as we'll come to later with diagnostics, you can get a special staining on the eggs to differentiate between the two, and I think that's really underused, and therefore I don't think we've got a true prevalence of where it is in the UK. We only know about it when favourable conditions allow an outbreak, and then you get dying sheep and clinical haemonchosis, then we know about it. But I actually think, and there's various studies that agree with this, that I think it's actually quite widespread, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause clinical disease unless all the conditions, all the planets align to be a problem and an outbreak. So certainly, as Kaz says, up in the northeast of England, we haven't been seeing that much of an issue with it until recent years, because it tends to be cold and wet in Yorkshire and Northumberland. But that picture is changing, and we are getting some warmer weather, and conditions are becoming more favourable for the replication of Haemonchus. And so we are also, like Kaz, relatively new to dealing with Haemonchus and learning with it a wee bit.
I know cold and wet could be a description for the Northwest, but not over the last few years, where, of course, at the moment we're in a drought, so it's warm and it's dry. So are they the sort of conditions that we really need to see to start seeing Haemonchus becoming more prevalent? Do they like the dry conditions?
They do, but not too dry.
Yeah,
Too dry, hot and dry is not good for the replication of any worms. They need moisture to complete their
yeah,
life cycle and such like. So it tends to be a change in conditions from warm and dry to then warm and wet.
yeah.
Can lead to an outbreak if all the other conditions are right, that the susceptible animals are there at the right time, and there's a mass development of these larvae on the pasture
Yeah.
when it comes wet. So yes, they do like heat, but not actually too dry.
So, in the north of England, when would we tend to expect to see outbreaks? Would it be in the late spring, early summer before maybe it gets too dry?
It's changing
Yeah,
as well. So Haemonchus is a highly prolific worm. It has a huge egg output and therefore turnover rate, and therefore its genetic variance and its ability to adapt is unlike any of the other gut worms. So the season seems to be changing as the worm adapts to what it's living in. So certainly we can see clinical disease from spring right through
mm.
to mid to late autumn, and I only suppose as weather patterns and things change, that could extend further yet.
And I think there was a report today at the Met Office, and they were saying, "Oh, climate is now changing. Not the weather, but the climate, so the more long picture." And that was very much becoming hotter but wetter because obviously there's more water in the atmosphere. Therefore, we're getting more rain, we're getting more storms, floods, and so
Yeah.
on as well. So there's definitely a change. I mean, just maybe explain, Kaz, what are we looking at from? I remember it was a sort of anemia, and I was doing a bit of studying before white eye disease. Maybe explain a bit about the clinical science to us and what you're seeing up in the northeast of England.
Yeah, so it's a spectrum effectively, and I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that yes, it is a roundworm, just like our other strongyles, but it's a blood-sucking roundworm, and so in some ways there's overlap in symptoms with liver fluke. So that's where it gets its
Mm.
common name, the barber pole worm, because if you look at one of the adult worms underneath a microscope, you can see that trademark barber pole, white and red, sort of round and round in a cylinder. And that red is your
Yeah,
sheep's blood that's been sucked out of it. So it all depends really on how big a dose of infectious larvae that sheep got over what time frame. So you can get really acute disease, and certainly we've not seen a lot of clinical disease. Don't get me wrong, I think it'd be a totally different story if you were talking to two practitioners from the southwest of England. But where we've seen it, it's been mostly quite acute disease, and I put that down to the fact, or nothing other than a hunch, that our ewes, sort of breeding sheep within the practice, probably haven't seen much Haemonchus before, and so now they are seeing it in these favourable conditions. They're getting a big whack of it, so a big infectious dose over a short amount of time, and so you're seeing these higher sort of adult burdens quickly, and you're getting this acute disease. So that would be, in some cases, it's been sudden death, which has been really interesting.
yeah,
Importantly, no scour. Often it's been unmasked. We think it's pasturella. You go and find a load of ewes or a handful of ewes killed, sort of knocked over. They're sometimes lean. The white eye disease you referred to there, that is the anemia. They are
mm.
bleeding these sheep dry, and so that's why when you look at the mucous membranes and most typically the conjunctiva, it's in severe cases white as a sheet, or certainly more pale than it should
Mm.
be. And we can talk about diagnostics later and how that feeds into those. Then you get to sort of the subacute and more chronic issues, sort of lower infectious doses but still causing an issue. Bottle jaw because they're losing protein. Clearly, that is fairly non-specific. Again, speaks more to fluke. yonis, possibly anything where they're not getting enough protein or they're losing too much protein. And then a chronic, sheep that just aren't doing very well. So that's ill
Yeah.
thrift, production issues.
And obviously not growing as quick as they could as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when it comes then to worm egg counts, clearly, they could be quite hard little dottles, which wouldn't, a farmer, and certainly probably most vets wouldn't associate with high worm burdens. But a very, very rough and ready rule of thumb I think we use as common practitioners in the practice is if the worm egg count is in the thousands and not the hundreds, you're probably looking at Haemonchus, to be confirmed with a peanut stain, which Dawn referred to. But that is sort of red flag.
And I suppose, as you're saying, because you're at the edge of the disease and it's becoming more common, the sheep have no immunity to Haemonchus either. So there's no innate immunity, no antibody immunity to try and fight it off, themselves.
Absolutely. And I think there used to be the case, we thought, I don't know, and where all this stuff comes from, I don't know, but we used to think that adult ewes did not build immunity to Haemonchus, a bit like liver fluke. But my understanding is that has changed, and we once they've had a good dose of it, if you like, they do. Yes, some ewes are going to, thanks to genetics, build up a resistance more quickly and more robustly. But it's not the case that if you've got it, you're going to have to treat ewes forevermore, because that, we're sort of taking us down a road that only ends one direction, which is resistance then. And I think that, Dawn drew a really important distinction between Haemonchus and Haemonchosis. I think these are all vets we're talking to, aren't we? So they'll understand the difference. Yeah. So the worm does not necessarily cause disease. And there's loads of interesting work, I think as far back as the 1950s, that showed Haemonchus the worm being present on farms, all the way up into Scotland, but no disease, and it's those favourable conditions overlaying with that presence of the worm that cause disease. And so it's just that those favourable conditions, I think, are becoming more prevalent. And it's not like, the first question a lot of our farmers ask when they have an issue, a clinical issue, is they say, well, where's it come from and who gave it to us? And actually, for a lot of our farmers, I think, not all, but I think a lot of them probably already have the species of worm on farm. It's just that normal northern English climate conditions are keeping it at bay until they don't.
Yeah.
I think we need to be a bit careful about whether they develop immunity or not, simply because of the sporadic nature of clinical disease.
Yeah.
And a lot of acquired immunity, requires trickle exposure to maintain that immunity. And I think because of the sporadic nature of outbreaks, because of sporadic, favourable conditions, I think we don't fully understand how long that immunity resistance to the worm may last, how complete it is, and actually whether they do develop full immunity or actually whether they remain a little bit susceptible going forwards, which is why we really need to get into the habit of bringing adult ewes into our monitoring programs on farm. I think farms are getting better and better at fecal egg count monitoring for their lamb crops, their growing lambs, their replacements. And because adult ewes typically have relatively strong immunity to some of our other gut worms, I think they aren't monitored as closely. And because we don't have scour as the first indication that we've got a parasite burden there, I think we need to get in the habit of bringing those adult ewes back into our monitoring programs and be monitoring with fecal egg counts, because they might be the first suggestion that there's a problem. As Kaz has said, and myself, just because we've got a high egg count doesn't mean to say it's Haemonchus, but it's the first suggestion to go looking further with either, with a peanut agglutinin stain to differentiate, is this Haemonchus, is it not? But certainly this acquired immunity, I don't think we fully understand it yet because of the sporadic nature of disease in the UK.
So Haemonchus less likely to kill an adult sheep is much more likely, unless there's other problems, much more likely to be, killing and affecting younger sheep. Is that fair to say?
No.
Not necessarily. No, if you've got a naive flock that hasn't, where you haven't had an outbreak of Haemonchus before, it can kill
Yeah,
adult sheep just as effectively
right.
as lambs for sure. And I think, we need to have it on our radar, and the age old, which I think we all use, never waste a dead sheep.
Yeah,
If you're getting mortality, we should be having a look in there, because you can
post-mortem.
see these adult worms, and you can see, as Kaz says, you can see the barber's pole and differentiate them really,
Yeah,
really easily on sight. Although my eyesight isn't as good as it used to be, and it's certainly easier with a magnifying glass. But you can see them in the fresh worms. If you take the worms and they dry out and they desiccate, by the time you've got to the practice to look at them under the microscope, that barber's pole disappears actually. So you need to be looking at them fresh, or keeping the worms moist if you're going to then look at them under a microscope. But that's often the first thing we see on farms that have never had Haemonchus before, because it almost catches them out, because you've got a field of sheep that aren't scoured, they're minding their own business, they look absolutely fine. And it's only when those sheep are then put under some pressure, like to be gathered or
yeah. Stress,
moved, that
stressful events.
the anemia that they're actually quietly suffering becomes too much for them, and you often get mortality in that point. So we should definitely, post-mortems are an absolute key cornerstone to diagnosing it, alongside your fecal egg counts.
So climate change has definitely made it more likely to happen. But then, is the parasite itself developing and adapting, and how is it doing that to to be able to, one, travel, and then two, have a much more pathogenic effect than perhaps it did 20, 30 years ago?
I don't think it is necessarily any more pathogenic. I think our weather is so much more unpredictable than it
Right.
used to be.
Yeah.
But because of this high prolificity of the worm, and one adult worm can lay greater than 5,000 eggs per day. So that, coupled with a relatively short life cycle, its reproductive potential is massive, and therefore there's a lot of genetic variation within that population, and therefore its ability to adapt, survival of the fittest in each circumstance,
Yeah.
its ability to adapt and survive what's in front of it is massive. So it certainly it adapts as it goes along, and I think that's why it's being more successful in
Yeah.
situations where it might never have been 50 years ago. I don't think it's actually more pathogenic. I think it's just more successful at survival and reproduction.
Kaz, maybe talk me through, then what is the control of that? Because obviously, if we use too much, I know, there's the possibility, as you said before, of getting resistance. So how do you balance that with, obviously, treatment, potentially preventative, but presumably always in? Do you wait until you see sign of worms before you would treat? Talk me through, the two of you, how you would perhaps, one, prevent, and then two, in the face of an outbreak, what would you be doing?
Yes, and give a real vetty answer and say it depends. So,
Yeah,
and I would say it as well. It's going back to, if we were in an area like the southeast or southwest, hotter, more favourable conditions for Haemonchus, it's going to be really interesting. What you're saying about acquired immunity there, Dawn, because I wonder whether us, say we're in the fringe up here, say for the rest of our professional life, we're in the fringe area for Haemonchus. Will sheep just only ever get a sporadic exposure compared to, say, will exposure be much more reliable down the southeast and southwest, and therefore sheep end up, they see less disease paradoxically because of that? I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to see, to monitor. But it's like treatment, all the cases we've seen pretty much have been acute disease. One was goats, and goats are just a bit of a basket case when it comes to parasite control, aren't they? So we'll leave them for a second. But again, it's partly because I think there's less awareness of it. It's because there's less of it. And like I say, they probably got a big infectious dose at once following some favourable conditions, and the ewes have never seen it. Comes down to the client you're working with, comes down to severity of the disease. I always think if there's someone's got their house on fire, you do not want the firefighters to turn up and say, should we talk about cladding or fire extinguishers? You want them to put the fire out. And then once the dust has settled, you can talk about some more sensible prevention things. So, when you've got, say, this time of year, ewes with lambs at foot, they're working hard, you've had the really favourable conditions, you've confirmed it clinically, that is the sort of instance where, as I think in our practice, some of us would go in fairly heavy-handed. You've got clinical cases. That's where we maybe go in with you've got broad spectrum products, and interestingly, we don't know the resistance profile of Haemonchus on a lot of our farms. Interestingly, I think we see more problems. If Dawn has the same, I'd be even more interested on some of our farms, which I would say are, in inverted commas, the best at worm control, because they've not dosed a ewe for years. They're monitoring the lambs pretty well, but they've sort of gotten past dosing ewes, and until they haven't, because they're doing nutrition pretty well, body condition score pretty well, and then the rod gets pulled from them. So those, when you've got a lot of dead sheep, I would say, it's where you go in with either a novel or just one of the three main wormer groups, or even the benefit of Haemonchus is that Clevedale, which we traditionally think of as a fluticide, is effective. So that's probably where you're going to go in and, dare I say it, treat everything in that mob, which is an exception to the rule, I suppose. But regardless of what you use, it's probably good to go in and do a post-drench check as well. Take samples when you're drenching, take samples 7 or 14 days later to make sure whatever you used has worked, because that's really important. And thereafter, you can go into more monitoring mode. We're just at that stage with a handful of our farms now. And like Dawn said, that's probably incorporating your ewe flock into the monitoring you might be doing with your lambs as well, especially in years where we start to get our sort of, our suspicions raised by just the weather, that pattern of hot and wet. Or I think definitely hot and dry followed by hot and wet, just warmth in particular helps. And then I think what we haven't seen, or at least found in our practice, is many cases, if any, of chronic haemonchosis, and that's where I think you'd pick them up and be more selective about who you treat. That's where you can use body condition score as a criteria. You could use the VETchat score, which is the sort of 1 to 5 scale of how pink their membranes are, and I can never remember which way round it is, but put it so
five's
anemic. Yeah, cool. So
nearly dead. Five's nearly dead.
You can get these. It's a little bit VETchat, I think, is a Southern Hemisphere scheme. You have to really go looking for the cards. You get a little printout card, and it's a universal language you have. So 5 is white sheet. White is a sheet, and 1 is totally normal, and all the grades in between. And basically 5 is a skull and crossbones. 4 is a drench gun. 3 is drench gun maybe. And you can, you don't have to speak English. You have to be able to read, not be colorblind. And so you go through the ewes, you check their conjunctival color, and go from there. What I will say is that the organization that make those cards are very protective over them, and I can see why, because so you can't just download it and print it out yourself. You have to find a vet who's got a connection with them, do some training, because you can see things, different printers print out different shades of red. Cards can get bleached in the sun or washed out in the rain. And so it's pretty mundane, but those sorts of things would end up having a big difference. The principle is, whether it's body condition score, mucous membrane color, as long as you're not in a the house is on fire scenario, you can be selective with who you treat.
Dawn, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think as Kaz alluded to, if they've got sheep dropping dead, you need to get in there and you need to put the fire out. and that's where, we often do go in hard with such a group 4 or a group 5 anthelmintic. But it's really important to realise that in the UK we don't have much recorded resistance to Haemonchus contortus yet, and it's really important to keep it that way. So we don't always need to be going in with the big guns in a more ongoing, situation. All of our classes of wormers should work fairly well against Haemonchus, but we need to check that they are. So we need to be doing those post-trench fecal egg counts. And if there are strong gall eggs remaining, it's really, really important that we then speciate those. So we ask the lab for the peanut agglutinin staining, because we need to know what's surviving those treatments. And if indeed it is Haemonchus that's surviving those treatments, we absolutely need to know that for future management, going forwards. But whenever we're worming with any the situation with any of our gut worms, it's really important that we need to think about maintaining that susceptible population on the farm. So Haemonchus has the potential to develop resistance very, very quickly because of its high turnover rate and its high reproductive rate. So it's really important that we don't do things like dose them and then move them onto clean ground, because if we do that, the only worms that are surviving in that sheep are those that are resistant to your anthelmintics. And we could very, very quickly create a resistant population of Haemonchus. So I think it's scary, Haemonchus, and people panic about it, and people are a little bit terrified of it because it's new. But we should keep our heads and treat it like another gutworm in terms of our SCOPS principles and how we actually manage and prevent anthelmintic resistance. Once we've got over that initial clinical disaster acute outbreak, we really need to then follow it up with a sensible approach to maintaining that in refugia population of susceptible worms, and not panic and leave it there and constantly use group 4s or and such like, and end up with the same situation that a lot of the southern hemisphere is in, which is the inability to manage Haemonchus because they did mass suppressive treatments all the time to try and get rid of it, eradicate it, which we can't do. And I think we must approach it better than that, and that's with post-trench checks. It's with maintaining the susceptible population. And it's scary to have a Haemonchus outbreak and dose everything and then put them back onto the same ground that you've just had that problem on. But we have to do that, really, unless we've left some untreated, like as Kaz was saying, unless we've used targeted selective treatment in them. I think we have to, in order to dilute any resistant worms that have that have been left, and then a good monitoring program in place. So I think it's trying to get that message out that it's new, it's a bit scary, but we can't lose those principles in the treatment and management of it. Otherwise, if we're having this conversation in another 20 years' time, it could be looking very, very different.
Just talk to me maybe about, in a group generic terminology, what would what are the treatments that you should be using? You have a hill farm, in the north of Yorkshire. You're mainly treating now, on the basis of egg counts and so on. So you find Haemonchus and you find a few dead sheep. Let's say it's 200 sheep, in that field, and 5 have died. What sort of treatments, what's the actual class of drug that you're using in that case?
The point is that there isn't much resistance reported in the UK. So actually any of our classes of wormers should be effective against Haemonchus. If we're treating lambs in the middle of summer, I would probably avoid group 1s because you're likely to have mixed infections. But again, this is all guesswork unless you do the staining, unless we do that peanut and agglutinin test. And so, I mean, don't get me wrong, if in an acute outbreak situation, you don't have time to wait for that result to come back, but that doesn't mean we still shouldn't be doing it. We can get in there and worm, but still send that off, because it's still useful information to make parasite control plans going forwards. So actually, depending on the time of year, any of our classes of wormers should and could be perfectly effective against Haemonchus, plus, as Kaz says, Clevedale. Clevedale is an opportunity for treating Haemonchus. If it's predominantly Haemonchus, the population, because we've sustained it, Clevedales can be used because it's narrow spectrum and it avoids us having to use those other classes. But we do need to take a whole broad picture of what's been used on the farm previously, because if they are a liver fluke infected farm, they may well have been using Clevedale quite heavily to treat liver fluke, depending on the history of the farm, and therefore Clevedale might not be what we choose, because the Haemonchus may already have had a reasonable amount of exposure to Clevedale in the past. So it's all about individual farm history, what they normally use, what they've heavily used on the farm, and what isn't. But I think we have to start with the idea that actually any of our classes of wormers could and should be effective against Haemonchus, and check them with those post-drench checks. Any remaining eggs, speciate them and find out what survived.
I presume, Kaz, if you have a warm and a wet environment and the fields are quite wet, then liver fluke and Haemonchus can obviously coexist very easily as well.
Yep, certainly possible. Certainly possible.
Yeah. It's been really interesting chatting about this, and obviously a problem. And this is where I think we need to be looking at climate change and the environmental changes that we're seeing, and having those mitigation plans, isn't it? And being aware of when things are emerging. So thank you so much for raising the awareness of this particular parasite that, maybe wasn't quite as much of a problem when I was at vet school and just coming out of vet school. And let's hope that we can continue to treat and help the welfare of the sheep, but obviously also health and production as well. Thanks so much. It's been really interesting.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for Elanco for making it possible, and thanks for everyone for listening, and hopefully see you on a podcast or a webinar very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.